Okay, guys. So yesterday we looked at the declaration of war. So Spain actually declared war on the United States after the U.S. blockaded Havana Harbor. So maybe what we should do right now is take a quick look at, America's now at war. Are we really ready for that war? So financially, when McKinley told the Congress to prepare for hostilities, he asked that the Congress set aside $50 million for the war. Now, number one, $50 million is a lot of money in my world. But we're talking about $50 million of back then money. So the annual budget of the United States back in those days was between $1 and $2 billion. So we're looking at somewhere between 3 and 5% of the budget of the US for the year back then. In today money, that would be comparable to, say, like $200 billion. Um, the entire nation of Spain in 1898 did not make $50 million in a year. So, with the US being able to put aside that much money just for fighting, it really just sent a message to Spain that we're so dead. Because remember, a big part of the victory of the North in the Civil War was financially, the North could support a war longer than the South could. Number two, tens of millions of dollars, nearly 2 decades, and a lot of weird boats that didn't have guns or had giant sticks of dynamite mounted in them or couldn't decide whether they were steam or sail or could potentially shoot themselves. Nevertheless, the United States Navy is updated and modern. It is ready to go. It may not be the equal of the British Navy, but it is more than ready to meet the Spanish Navy. Just as a case in point, the Spanish Pacific Fleet was still using wooden ships in 1898. You can just think about that. So, financially, in economics, America is ready for a war. Navy wise, America is ready for a war. Army, not so much. First problem, America's entire army in 1898 was only about 25 million men. Spain had, or sorry, 25,000 men. My apologies. Wrong, too many zeros. So America's army was 25,000 men. Spain had 200,000 in Cuba alone. So America was outnumbered about 8-1. Second problem, and I'll post a video on the second one here. The United States decided in the 1880s to not invest in the newly created Maxim gun, the world's first real machine gun. You pulled the trigger, 600 shots a minute, and it just kept shooting. The U.S. felt that that was a waste of bullets. We relied on our old hand crank Gatling guns. Now, to be fair, the Gatling gun could get 300 shots a minute, which ain't shabby at all. But if your arm gets tired, you slow down that shooting rate. And unlike the Maxim gun, that all you have to do is keep connecting belt fed ammunitions together, you have to actually change out cartridges on the Gatling gun. But it was cheaper and used less bullets. So that's why we stuck with the Gatling gun. Then there's the issue we had talked about last unit of the Krag Jorgensen bolt action rifle. Yes, it is a multi shot bolt action rifle, but it is vastly inferior to the German manufactured Mauser rifle that Spain had by the thousands. The real problem here is that the bolt action rifle on the Mauser, you opened up the top of the gun, you pulled the bolt back. You had a clip of shots. It was a long row of shots, one on top of each other. You pushed it inside the gun, you clicked the bolt, and the gun was ready to go. On the Krag, you had to open up a little side compartment and individually put each shot in one at a time with the using the bolt action to load the shots and put them in the magazine. And the shots sat tip to back so that if something happened where the gun got hit, the gun would explode. Um, the Mauser had a rate of fire approximately 5-1 greater than the Krag Jorgensen. Now, on the flip side, to be perfectly fair to the U.S., the Krag was a superior gun. It had better accuracy and longer range. which is why the US bought it, because we felt that it would be a better thing to get guys to be better at shooting. The problem is it's really hard to do something when people are shooting 5 shots to every one you can get off, even if your one is more accurate. Next problem. The US Army was designed to defend America from attack, not to launch attacks. The Army had no way of transporting itself to Cuba. Now, um, we had to hire private boats to do that. And this became quite problematic because the boats couldn't handle hauling the horses, and in some cases, couldn't handle hauling the heavy equipment like cannons and stuff down to Cuba. It made for a long wait. Last but not least, the uniforms of the United States Army. The uniforms were made of heavy wool, and they were basically designed for fighting in the colder areas of the northern part of the U.S., around the Great Plains and the Pacific Northwest. You're in a tropical jungle in Cuba in the middle of July where it's 110 without the humidity being factored in. There were literally soldiers dying because of how hot their uniforms were. So, all of these are problems that really translate out to the Army is not ready for fighting. Now, it is true that the U.S. Had a huge enlistment after the disaster with the Maine, but the problem was is that those men who enlisted weren't trained and they didn't have enough equipment to train them with. So it's going to be kind of an interesting challenge. Okay. Oops. Strategy. The U.S. strategy is very straightforward. I'm going to go back a minute because I want to show you a picture here. Okay. I will post the video on the Maxim gun for you. So here is the island of Cuba. Okay. To the direct north of Cuba here. Okay. This is Havana. The U.S. Navy has blockaded Havana already. Okay. The strategy that the U.S. is going to undertake is the U.S. forces will go from Florida around to the south of Cuba and land on the south part of the island. The U.S. Navy will blockade Santiago, Cuba, and Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. These two areas, okay, what the U.S. is hoping to do is to bottle up the Spanish Atlantic Fleet and prevent the Navy from being of any use in the battles. At the same time that the Navy is doing that, the Navy is going to send the Marine Corps from Guantanamo Bay to Santiago, where eventually the Army will make its way across and link up with the Marines, and they will take out Santiago and effectively end the war. Now, why would this effectively end the war? Because at the same time that the Spanish are fighting us, they're still fighting the Cuban rebels. So this is one way to take care of that problem. Okay, so very simple strategy. Oops. So let's briefly. So all the Army really has to do is land and move through two areas: the San Juan Heights and a small town called El Cane, where they will have to deal with the Spanish. But that's what they have to get through to get to Santiago. So let's take a brief sidetrack and talk about the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, the old Ted Meister who prepared the Navy so well for its fight against Spain. Teddy is not just a I'm going to talk a big game guy. He is I'm going to play the big game. And Teddy resigned his position in the government and instead formed the American Volunteer Cavalry Corps, more commonly referred to as the Rough Riders. So, in order to sort of understand this a little bit, let me give you some background. Teddy Roosevelt came from a very, very wealthy New York family. His family were millionaires. And when Teddy was young, he was a very sick, very scrawny, very puny child. He had a case of asthma so severe that his parents and, in fact, his doctor thought that he would die before the age of 5. Roosevelt survived. Now, Daddy Roosevelt, very practical man as well as being very rich, just sat Teddy down one day and said, basically, look, nature hates you and wants to kill you, Teddy. You have two choices. You can let nature kill you, or you can fight nature. Which one do you want to do? Teddy dedicated himself to fighting nature, and he grew up. By the time he got into college, he was a literal beast of a human being. He was essentially like he had the body of a power lifter. There was very few, if any, physical activities that Teddy would not engage in. He did gymnastics, he did heavy weightlifting, he did the early proto forms of aerobic activity. He was involved in playing football and boxing at Harvard. He was on the crew team that's professional rowing at Harvard. Um, these were all very physical activities. While in college, Teddy met a girl and fell in love. And the plan was very simple. They were going to move back home to the palatial Roosevelt estate. Teddy and his wife would occupy like the third floor of the house, while mom and dad Roosevelt had the first floor of the house. And everything would be honky dory. Teddy would go into politics, which is what he wanted to do, and things would be great. Well, things didn't quite work out that way when Mrs. Teddy Roosevelt became pregnant but died giving birth to their daughter, Alice. At the same time that Teddy's wife was dying from giving birth, at the first floor of his house. So Teddy and his wife are on the third floor, and mommy, Teddy's wife dies giving birth. On the first floor, Teddy's mom dies. Same day, same house. Teddy was devastated. He took his newborn daughter, Alice, dropped her off at his sister's house, and said, "You handle it, I'm out of here." And for 2 years, Teddy moved out to the West where he became a cowboy. Now, it's kind of funny to realize that he was a monstrous beast of a man, but he had thick Coke bottle glasses because he could barely see anything. And he had a really high, squeaky voice, and he liked to use very large words. So this didn't really go over well with a lot of the cowboys, and he got into sort of a lot of disagreements over it, but he quickly made a reputation of being one tough dude who was willing to just put up with stuff. And, if he got sick of it, he would just beat the shnikes out of you. It worked out well. Teddy made a lot of friends in his 2 years out there, including, I would just like to say, he met my great great grandfather, and he and my great great grandfather became friends. Now, Teddy returned to New York, where he picked up his young daughter, and 6 weeks later, reconnected with his childhood sweetheart and got married, and they had a big family too. We'll talk more about the issue of Teddy and his kids later because there's some problems. But I bring this up because when Teddy resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he sent off letters and telegrams to all of his friends, inviting them to come on the grand adventure of fighting a war. And boy, did he get a motley assortment of people to show up. Ivy League graduates, doctors, lawyers, engineers, professors. If they, everybody from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, all of those elite Ivy League schools. So it's like nerd battle. Secondly, cowboys. Those same cowboys he had met and been hanging around with for 2 years, he invited to come back with him and go to invade Cuba. By the way, my great great grandfather was one of those cowboys who came with Teddy. He fought with Teddy at the battles that the Rough Riders were in. Convicts. Yes, Teddy had friends who were criminals for various and sundry offenses, and he invited them to come with too, because who doesn't love a convict going to war? I know I do. And last but not least, a group of people known as the Buffalo Soldiers. They were the Army's all African American unit. And they got their name because the American Indians believed that because of their skin color, they were spiritually connected somehow with the buffalo. Teddy Roosevelt has the very first completely all integrated Army unit in U.S. history. Blacks and whites being together, nobody really caring about anybody else. It's all going to be one happy hippie kumbaya family while we go kill people. Now, part of the problem, let's go back here. This is a volunteer cavalry unit, which means that they need horses. The horses don't get to Cuba. That's problematic. Only Teddy and a few of the officers actually have horses. Second problem, because they're a cavalry unit, They have cavalry rifles. The cavalry rifles are shorter range and less accurate. They're designed to be used from horseback. Now, this does not stop them from being used, but it does make things more challenging. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more in our next lesson about the actual fighting. We'll leave it off here. Peace and love.